So tonight we're going to talk about the choreography of treatment flow and really talk about the processes that I believe are true about treatment flow, which is that I really genuinely and wholeheartedly believe this is a whole team process. Oftentimes when we think about case acceptance, we think about the person who presents the treatment, and I'm really talking about all the things that lead up to presenting the treatment. I wanted to say this, like I went back and forth and was like, should I say this? Should I not say this? But I got to tell you guys something that is true about creating a lecture. I love the content of what I've created tonight. I love being with groups of people and talking about what we're going to talk about tonight and plenty of other things. But I despise coming up with a title for a webinar. I feel like it is so binding. I feel like it limits me. So I might veer off tonight from experiences and examples all around the choreography of treatment flow. But as I was putting this together, I'm like, oh man, I hope they don't expect me to like lay out the two-step for treatment flow. In fact, I'd almost like to suggest that the choreography of treatment flow for me really means what are the critical steps that I think are necessary to facilitate new and different conversations with patients that lead patients to have the ability to make a different choice with the knowledge that we learn from them and the knowledge that we share about their current state of health. And I'm going to talk to you tonight really about some tips and tricks to facilitate that, which I just shared. So here's a breakdown of the dance moves, or don't worry, I'm not going to spend the whole night talking about the analogy of dance, but I thought this was pretty good. So these are the things that we're going to talk about tonight. There's probably more than a dozen systems that I think will help improve treatment flow. We're going to talk about 3, an emphasis on 2, and 1 that I think is critical and you're probably already doing in your practice. We're going to talk about a process tonight that I think can really help your entire team build competence around your restorative or practice philosophy that will help them have the confidence to begin different conversations with patients. And then we're going to talk about the key parts to an effective handoff. Really, what does that mean? Where does it start? And some of the parts that I really love to talk about with regards to handoff in a 50-minute webinar. Okay, so this is on the right is the face that I had sitting in the One Club the very first time I walked into the Pankey Institute. And I think that smile says it all. And to the left are 2 of the most highly regarded humans in my life, Dr. Melody Ward on the right, and Dr. Sherry, I knew I was going to say Dr. Sherry Kay, and then Ms. Sherry Kay. And both of these humans have been along with me in the journey of my work with the Pankey Institute. And it was just a delight to spend some time with them a couple of years ago for the first time when I walked into the Pankey Institute. This is at the Pankey Hygienist Workshop. I'm going to talk about several of the courses for the Pankey Institute tonight. But nothing was more joyful than when I got the opportunity to be a part of this community and then stand in front of the room and begin my journey as a facilitator and presenter for the Pankey Institute. So, all right. So as we get into the conversation of treatment flow and what I think are some critical points that we'll talk about tonight, I think one of the things I'm wondering if you're noticing is, and so these points that I'll talk about tonight will really be helpful if you're noticing patients who seem to be clear on treatment. You have the conversations, but by the time they make it up front, they don't schedule, or maybe they do schedule and don't keep their appointment. Maybe you're noticing that your front office team is coming back often enough. I don't know what you would say is a lot, but often enough, maybe a couple times a day, to clarify, what are we doing? When are we doing it? Or just really any question around what the patients might have as questions for their treatment plan. Maybe you're also noticing that you and the team, or if you're a team member, you and your doctor are tracking metrics that just aren't improving. I want to talk about what I think that means. Or maybe you're in an organization, or you're leading an organization that has a fairly new team. Now, I say that a fairly new team meaning in its wholeness. Myself and my business partner were just talking with a practice, two-doctor perio practice, a couple of days ago, and they were talking about their teams not that new, about a year or more. I smiled. But one of the things that we discovered, and they were having some issues with their treatment plan flow, is that their new team members, some of them didn't even come from dentistry. They're little more than a year or so into the practice. And, one of the uncoverings is maybe the team as a whole, we have never sat down to really talk about our treatment philosophy and talk about the way we practice and why we practice that way. So if you answered yes to any of those, or if your eyebrow was raised to any of those, I think there'll be some great nuggets for you tonight. I have the blessing and it is a pure gift for me I work with dental teams all over the country. My role outside of working with the Pankey Institute is I'm a practice management coach. I myself and my business partner have a company called Upstream Dental Practice Coaching. And so we're working with a practice outside of Atlanta, and an office manager and a dentist are just struggling to be effective communicators with each other as well as with their team. And I got the opportunity to sit down and facilitate some learning with the office manager using a emotional intelligence survey that she completed. And there was a paragraph that stood out to me that I really wanted to highlight. I have to do something though. My head keeps getting in the way of, okay, good deal. So here it is. The first paragraph goes on to talk about, building emotional intelligence. And then this paragraph really stood out to me as they talk about emotional intelligence. It says, for most of us, we get stuck in patterns of behavior that make it hard to choose the most effective or a more effective response every time when we engage and we connect with people, right? There are times where our emotional intelligence and our working relationship requires us to really lean in and listen with curiosity. There's also times where our team dynamics and the needs of the team require us to be more objective and be more sort of driven. And having the ability to kind of manage those needs, or the needs of a team or the needs of a patient, I think are really, really critical. And in order to do that, we really have to tap into our emotional intelligence. I wanted to give you a little bit of a backstory. And so this paragraph stood out. So by now you've already read it, but I think the thing that stood out to me, and the thing that this office manager and I are really talking about, is the stuckness of our patterns, right? Of the patterns of our behavior. And while we rely on these familiar responses, we know they're not the best choice. We know from time to time they're ineffective, or we even have this dialogue, this little gremlin on our shoulder after the exchange, like, oh, that's not what I wanted to say, or how I wanted to say it, or, I didn't intend to deliver it that way. But because those are our responses and those are our patterns, they're hard to undo. And so I think that tonight's conversation, my hope is, my main hope for you is that you identify some patterns of behavior that may be challenging the way that you engage in your treatment plan flow with patients. And maybe a couple, maybe even just one of those patterns you highlight and begin to pay attention and find different pathways or a new way to respond or engage with the team and patients that might result in a different outcome. One of my favorite organizations, the Arbinger Institute, has several amazing books. One of them is called The Outward Mindset. And so I sort of borrowed this from the Arbinger Institute and the Outward Mindset book. And so I show this slide in every single conversation I ever have with a large group or even with my teams, because I'm imagining you came to this webinar to learn something different, and you're hoping that learning you can take back and apply it into your clinical practice, into your daily practice at work. And what I want to tell you is, yay, that you want to do that. And if you go back and try to just change your way of being, right? Like, I'm going to talk about handoffs tonight. So maybe you're like, okay, Monday, let's just start practicing handoffs the way that she talked about. We pick these 2 pieces in the handoffs and let's just start doing them. Right? You just like to get into action. And I love that. But what I've come to understand about patterns of behaviors is what precedes behavior change is actually the way we think about things. What precedes behavior change is our mindset and our beliefs around that thing. And so this is another great analogy that I always think of. So if I say to myself, I'm gonna change my workout pattern and I want to increase my steps, I begrudgingly say that, like, fine, okay, I'm going to increase my steps. But if my mindset around increasing its steps is sort of like 2 thumbs down, like, I don't really want to do it. I want to hit the goal of 10,000 steps, but I don't really want to get on the treadmill. When I go and I get on the treadmill, what's likely going to be happening is that I'm going to literally be counting every step, maybe begrudgingly, maybe not at first, but eventually, to the point at which I'm likely not going to complete my steps, right? And I'm imagining you can relate to this in some way, shape, or form, because I know I'm not the only person who's wants to create change in their life, but also hasn't shifted their mindset and their beliefs around it. So if you want something to be different, we have to think about it differently. We have to look at our beliefs and our patterns around it. We have to begin to practice at least one new thing, right? A different way of being, a behavior change, right? Getting on the treadmill, but also how I think about being on the treadmill. That results in a different outcome. And The Outward Mindset's a great book if you want to expand on this thinking. A lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight really comes from a way I describe partnership in a dental practice. And in fact, I call it, we call it restorative partnership. So restorative partnership is anchored in several different principles. I'm going to cover a few of them tonight, but I want to hit the highlights of this. And we really do a deep dive into the work of restorative partnership at Pankey Hygiene. And so when I use the term, I thought I would just kind of share a few bullets on what I mean when I talk about partnership or restorative partnership. So when I think of restorative partnership, I think it's a partnering of both the clinical and behavioral aspects of the treatment process. I know that the title was Choreography of Treatment Flow, but in order for us to look at the way that we get a different outcome, we have to look at the behaviors that get us there, not just how do we talk about dentistry differently, but how do we engage with patients differently? How do we begin the co-discovery process with patients? There are 3 parts, 3 people or parts to restorative partnership. It includes the patient, it includes the team, and it also includes the dentist. And simple way is a collaboration, a connection, an engagement. In a much different way, it's an expansive process. It's not a one and done. It doesn't end at the appointment. So queuing up, how do we start to build the tools and the processes to have better treatment outcomes? I think the single greatest tool to get different treatment outcomes is to go as far upstream as we can possibly go to where do treatment conversations begin. And those treatment conversations and the restorative conversations, they begin in our head as a team. What do we know about our restorative process? What do we know about our philosophy? What do we know about our doctor's vision for the practice and for patients? What do we know about it? So much that when we begin having conversations about what we see in the patient's mouth and starting to connect the dots with patients' wants and needs, we have the competence built and the knowledge built about what we do and how we do the dentistry here in the practice. And so that it facilitates a higher level of confidence to start these conversations with patients. And so I'm going to take a step back because I get so excited. Sometimes I just jump in. I want to think for tonight's conversation, if you're scratching your head around how do I get my team, or if you're a team member, how do I have different conversations with patients around what's going on in their mouth, I think the number one tool is to really start to build a whole team approach to understanding our restorative philosophy. I call them in-house study clubs or clinical calibration meetings. I don't know what you call them or what you're going to call them, but whatever it is, how I define it is this. These are roundtable discussions. I have an emphasis on roundtable discussions because this is not a doctor-led, lecture about with 38 slides around restorative treatment. This is all the team around the table in conversation around what we do, how we do what we do, and why we do what we do. As I mentioned, I don't think this the most effective way to do these calibration meetings are for the doctor to lead it. But initially, as I lay this out, and I will here over the next 2 slides, you may determine that it makes more sense for the doctor or doctors to lead the beginning meetings. I also think that, and so you're familiar with study clubs, right? You go to them all the time. You have Pankey study club. We have plenty of experience with study clubs that we know what happens in there. And just like the study clubs that you might be attending or your docs are attending, or you as a hygienist or provider are attending, the effectiveness of the learning is really maximized with repetition and consistency. So when I talk about sitting down around the table, what I'm really talking about is creating a cadence or a team meeting cadence where these treatment conversations and treatment philosophy conversations can happen consistently. The recommendation that I make for these study club cadences in the beginning, and if you said yes to a lot of those questions on that earlier slide, in the beginning, I'd recommend frequent, once a month. And if you just gasped because you don't have once a month meetings, I just created an entire content. In the next slide, I'm going to talk about exactly how to break it down and what to discuss for your team meetings, all around restorative philosophy, all around building and engaging your team in the restorative process so they can feel more confident to facilitate these partnership conversations with patients for a multitude of reasons, right? So that the sole responsibility of the restorative conversations doesn't rest in the dentist's lap. So that in your hygiene appointments, the beginning of the treatment plan process can be discussed by the hygienist long before the dentist even comes in the operatory, to reduce the amount of back and forth time that your front office team has to come back and find you and ask about the restorative process, for a myriad of other reasons. So thinking about these study club meetings, the biggest recommendation I can make is that you get them in the schedule. At minimum, they're 1 hour in length. The optimal time is about 90 minutes. I say 90 minutes because I know oftentimes these meetings will happen during a lunch hour, and you're going to run late from your morning, and your meeting's not going to start until 1:19, 19 minutes after you were supposed to start. And if you have patients, if it's a 90-minute meeting and you have patients coming in at 2:30, some of them are going to come early, and somebody's going to forget a fork when they sit down on the lunch table. I know how these go. So if you can forego having them at lunchtime, that would be awesome. So here's what you're going to be working on. So number one, these internal or in-house study clubs might just start by simply identifying by a production report, what are our most common services? What are our top 10 services? What are the things that we talk about and do every day, all day, that we could lay out in these calibration meetings and really document what is the treatment we're talking about? Why do we do this, right? When do we recommend it? How do we do the treatment? And even maybe some examples. I identify documentation as a critical point to calibration meetings because I've seen practices in the past sit down, talk about the dentistry we do in a highly effective way, in a very engaging way, but without documentation of these processes. When we have team transition or we have team growth and we fold somebody in and we come back to these services, we're simply having to remember, how do we typically talk about it? And so I really like the idea that as you begin these calibration meetings, and maybe you pick the top 10 services, you take and create and document the treatment for all top 10 services, create a label, create a title, what is the service, create why we do these services, and get it into writing so that you have something that allows you to come back to this at a future calibration meeting. It'd be also great training for a future team member. Another option for these calibration meetings would be to, for each meeting, pull up a couple new patients that you've recently met in the last 30 days, right? New patients. Discuss things in the calibration like, what did we know about them when they first called? What was their primary want or need? What else did we discover? Let's look at the images together. Let's look at the collection of findings. Let's look at the things that happened in the hygiene assessment or the initial exam. What does the chart tell us? What do our notes tell us? What can we glean in terms of critical information to learn about, first of all, to learn about our new patients in our practice, to learn how they just found out about us, to learn what their primary need was, and then to also look as a team with a fresh set of eyes at all of the images and the treatment plan that resulted as a result of this, and really start to orient with the dentistry that was recommended or the dentistry that was completed. I think more than anything, the emphasis I will make on these in-house or internal study clubs or calibration meetings, whatever you want to call them, it doesn't matter, is start anywhere. The dentistry you do every day is most familiar to you as the dentist. So you could pick a small handful of the services that maybe you want to grow. and sit down and spend multiple meetings investing in the conversations behind the scenes with your team about how to create some competency on these treatments, so that when they begin the conversations with patients or they're asked questions from patients, they have the confidence to be able to answer them in a way that aligns with your philosophy and your language. So one of the other tricks to the trade in coaching that I will find has been highly effective when I'm with a practice and we actually do these meetings together is small group breakouts. And we have a practice in Kansas City, and one of the things that we just did recently with them, it's a larger team, I think, 14 people, I think, is one of the things we were getting a little sort of dry in the engagement, low engagement. And so we took the questions that we were posing for these calibration, which is, what do you see? What do you understand from patients' need? What questions do you have about what you see in the imaging? And we did it by quadrant, and we broke them out into small groups. And for sure, what changed was the engagement. Small group breakouts facilitate better engagement. There's safety in small numbers. So if you have a large team and you're considering doing something like this, my ideas are simple and basic to implement. You might have some better ideas on how you can do this. If you're getting low engagement, consider breakouts to shift up the engagement, and give them a couple simple questions to ponder in their small group breakouts. Give them 10 minutes to process and bring them back, and have them do sort of a download of, what did you discuss? What did you see? What are the questions that showed up? These can be really effective. I'm going to pause here before I move on to the handoff. And Desiree, I'm having a hard time mousing to the chat. So my question to you would be, are there any questions in the chat or in the Q&A? And guys, as I pose this question, for Desiree to look, I realize I would like to take a moment here and pause. Did I go too fast? Is there something I could come back to and talk more about? Do you have some ideas about implementing this that you'd like to run past me? For me, there's nothing that's more important in our conversation tonight than making sure the ideas that you have go from idea to action. Anything in the chat yet?
Not yet. We did have one in the Q&A, and they were asking, what is the name of the book by Arbinger Institute?
Called The Outward Mindset. And I just moved into some new bookshelves and cases, and I looked for it earlier so I could pull it out and show you guys, and I just can't seem to find where I put it. So I will be looking for that book, but it's called The Outward Mindset. They wrote a couple other books, and these are, in fact, the same doctor and office manager that I talked about earlier that are working on their communication styles and their working relationship. He is actually going to read another book by the Arbinger Institute called Leadership and Self-Deception, a phenomenal book for leaders, business owners who would like to evaluate a more effective way to work with and be with their team and engage. So that's another keeper. Anything else in there before I move on, Desiree?
They're just asking about the START code, which I have it posted again in the chat. If anybody else missed it, it's in the chat along with the CE letter. But other than that, we don't have any other questions as of right now.
Good deal. So I said tonight that I would talk about 3 systems. System number 1, and I think if you clicked off at this point and the only thing you took away was, I don't want you to do that, and the only thing that you took away was, man, I'm struggling with my team being a part of the restorative partnership. I'm struggling maybe as a team member being able to explain our dentistry. My doc comes in and he or she always has to explain it all. If you're noticed if you have any of those sort of noticings at work, one of the best places to start is to meet with your team, decide a timeline and a cadence, right? So a rhythm. Decide if we can we meet monthly? Can we sit down around the table? And guys, I don't care if it's messy. I think the beginning of clinical calibration or treatment planning summits or these in-house study clubs, whatever the heck you want to call them, they'll always be messy in the beginning. You're going to be stretching and doing something and practicing something that's really different that maybe you haven't done before. And so I can't stress enough that that's really one of the most important places to start. And I will tell you that I had this revelation many years ago when I first started lecturing that I would talk about the hygiene assessment. I'm a hygienist by trade and by practice, and I haven't practiced in about 12 years. But man, that never stops coursing through your veins, that hygiene love. And I remember I was standing in front of the room, and this was probably close to 10 years ago. And I was talking about the hygiene handoff, and I was talking about the hygiene assessment, and I was talking about restorative partnership. And someone asked a question in the room and said, so you want me to have different conversations with patients, and you want there to be a different handoff, but I don't actually feel comfortable talking about dentistry. And so I must have had my bossy pants on, my sassy pants on. I was like, oh yeah, I get that. I get it. You don't believe you're a diagnostician. I call myself a pre-diagnostician. As a hygienist, I would at least pre-diagnose what I noticed in the mouth, right? The unarguable things that I could see. I digress. So I thought she was asking like, oh, I can't diagnose, so how can I be a restorative partner? How can I plant the seed for what I see in the mouth? And what she was really saying is I don't really understand the dentistry we do. And that was, I had to take a couple steps back, but that was a pivotal moment for me, both as a hygienist. I realized I took for granted that the dentist I worked for, who invested a ton of time helping his entire team understand, what does a crown prep look like? What did the crown look like that he took off, that he was going to re-prep and put a new crown on? He helped us understand what a tooth looked like inside. At the time we were using Diagnodent, we thought it was great technology. I mean, he invested in helping us really understand, what does a quadrant of dentistry look like prepped? And even though it was more about the dentistry back then for me, what he helped me do, and what I realized I was missing in the beginning of these lectures with teams, was I already had the competence to talk about the dentistry. So I had a lot of confidence to broach conversations with patients that maybe felt a little trickier for teams who hadn't had the time to invest, or hadn't yet invested in the time to sit down and talk about restorative philosophy. And it was a miss for me. And I'll never forget that moment. And from that point on, talking about finding ways to have calibration meetings consistently. This is not a one and done, right? This is not like have 3 or 4 and then everybody understands what we do. As a dentist and as a clinician, as a human, as we grow and develop and decide new things, right? And change our way of practice, we've got to go back to the table and calibrate on those ways. So she helped me in more ways than she knows. So let's talk about elevating your handoff. So first I want to define, what do I mean when I talk about a handoff? When I think about a handoff, it's not even in the context of dentistry. So for me, a handoff is just an exchange of important information and conversations. In this case, I'm talking about patient focus, but if I were to meet with a vendor, Clear. I love Clear. I love their in-house membership plans. If I were to meet with them and then I meet with a doctor and I want him or her to consider looking at in-house membership plans, I would send a handoff email to my to Ian, my connection at Clear, and to the doctor. I would send a handoff email because I have gleaned some information from my doctor and I want to connect these two. So whatever important information I can exchange to connect them, I want to do. And so when I think about a handoff in the operatory, or I think about a handoff from the clinical team to the front office team, the goal of a handoff is to elegantly create an exchange of information based on the conversation and the stuff that we collected right along the way in my hygiene assessment, in my exam, that I transfer to the next person who walks in the room. In most cases, at least in the hygiene case, that would be the doctor who's coming in to do the exam. And the reason why I think handoffs are critical, there's multiple reasons. One, I think of patients' stories, and I think of patients' wants and needs as they share them with me as an important gift. I didn't think about it that way when I was practicing hygiene initially, and I didn't think about that way when I was in clinical, when I was in my clinicals for hygiene. I thought, oh, my instructor comes in, I talk about the patient to my instructor. It was very transactional, and was also true initially when I started doing handoffs in my clinical practice. And through some coaching and through some of my own observations, and even some of my own frustrations of having conversations with patients and seeing that it was going right over their head, I realized I needed a different way to exchange information with them through code discovery. I also needed a different way to exchange information when the doctor came in the room, because I was noticing that I would get all this information from the patient. We would have this great exchange and conversation and great connection. And then the doctor would come in the room and those same questions would be asked again of the doctor, eating up precious time. For me, diminishing the value of our initial conversations, and also diminishing what I would say was probably a little bit of trust with the patient, who might be saying to themselves, and I know this is true, I say this in my medical office, I'm going to tell you my story. Then the next person that's going to come in is going to ask me the same questions. I'm going to tell you that story again. And then when the doctor comes in, I'm going to have to say it again. So a handoff eliminates all of that. When done well. So I like to think of a handoff as a way of taking all of the information and packaging up in a nice, neat box. And the handoff itself is this beautifully well-wrapped package. So it was with one of my favorite periodontists a month or so ago, and we were doing a lecture together, and I was looking for an image of a package, and I came up on the internet, of course, there's always great things, to a boutique owner who had this well-wrapped gift shown. And she kind of described the well-wrapped gift in a way that I thought perfectly articulated a handoff. And she says, never underestimate the power of a well-wrapped gift. So a customer purchased the contents. A lovely customer posted this photo of a gift that she purchased for her husband. And the boutique owner, of course, knew what was inside of the box. And she also says, man, it's, pretty fabulous gift. But she chose to wrap it with a pretty fabulous wrapping. And I just thought it was a great way to articulate how a handoff, we take all this beautiful information that we get from a patient, and the way that we transfer that information can either be scrappy and messy and redundant and break down trust, or it can be well wrapped and succinct and in an order that makes sense to both the patient, the doctor, and the team member doing the handoff. And so I want to break down what I think are some key points to the handoff. And in this case, I'm showing you an example of a handoff that might be completed in the hygiene operatory. Okay, so this might be your recare patient. I like to think of examples for the handoff that feel like you could easily transfer this um, on Monday morning. In theory, first, I want you guys to sit down and talk about this, but in theory, I could easily transfer this and apply it to my patients on Monday morning. So, well, this also makes me jog my memory back to when I was a practicing hygienist. There was a lot of frustration that I was noticing, and the other hygienist that I was practicing with, that we were noticing that when our doctor would come into the operatory, he would jump in and ask all the questions that we had already asked. And again, I already shared, it eats up time, it creates frustration. And it really made me feel poorly about the time that I had spent with the patient, as if it was sort of less valuable. And so it came up in a team meeting, and the conversation kind of led us to come up with a checklist. And the reason why our doctor would jump in and do that is because he didn't feel confident that we were going to lead the handoff, if you will. We didn't call it that at the time, but now I know that's what we say. And that's what we call it, because he wasn't confident that we were going to lead it in the order and have the organization that he liked. So that's why he jumped in. And that was a big piece of learning for me, again, early on in practice management, that it's important to sit down with your entire team and decide, what is the way in which we want to exchange information in our handoff? How do you want it to go? I'm suggesting this as some order and organization to your handoff. This may not land, but I'm certain if you sit down together as a team and say, how do we want, when the doctor comes in the operatory, how do we want an exchange of information to go? I'm going to hit the highlights of what I think are important. But I think if you were to sit down and do that at a future team meeting, it may be highly effective. What I loved about hearing my doctor say, I don't have confidence that, and it wasn't because he didn't believe in us, it was just that it was another pattern and another habit. I loved hearing that he said, if you guys could create the order basically in this way, or cover all of these things, and I don't really care if you go in this order, but I want all these things covered. I loved knowing, oh, this is what you want. Okay, great. Game on. Let's show you that we can do this. But in the absence of that information, we were running these, handoffs, and guiding him through his exam the way that we thought we should. And my guess is, and I've had a lot of experience in working with teams, this might be happening in your practice. You're running it the way you thought you should run it, and not necessarily the way the entire organization wants the handoff to be run. So I'm going to hit some of the highlights. I think it's incredibly important, and this was important to my doctor. He always asked us, can you in some way, shape, or form mention the patient's name, not in an awkward way like, oh, doctor, here's Mary, but maybe, saying good morning to your doctor as he or she is walking in, and Mary and I were just catching up on, or we were happy to see you, mentioning something good or positive. These again are taken from several docs. This actually handoff was originally taken from Dr. Chris Leisler. We've modified it. I know Dr. Mark Clive uses something really, really similar. We use this exact handoff document in our Pankey hygienist workshop. We go through and we facilitate how to do an effective handoff, the order and the organization. So this came straight from Pankey. So we always start off by trying to use the patient's name, saying something good or positive just to set the tone. It's nice. Patients are listening for when you're about to, blow their cover and talk about the things that are going on in their mouth. And so it's really nice to start with something positive. I like to, when I do a handoff, tell the patient how the handoff is going to go, or how the flow is going to go. So, I might say to my patient, so Mary, I'm going to catch Dr. Ward up on the things that we talked about. You and I went back and forth about several things going on today. So I'm going to catch Doctor up. If I miss something, Mary, will you jump in? And I say that so that she knows I'm about to begin the conversation with my doctor, but also with her, so that she does not feel like an object over a subject. And I want to emphasize that. I think if there was one thing that you did differently in your handoffs and you didn't follow anything on this handoff slide, I'm good with it. But if the one thing you did shift is to consider when I think about restorative partnership, and I think what's one simple behavioral step that I could make that might create a different experience for my patient, it would be shifting my conversation at that handoff from talking about the patient to talking with the patient and to the patient. So this might sound really different and edgy. And when I'm with practices and we're in the operatory walking through this, this is definitely something that puts them on their edge of their learning, which is this handoff actually happens with Mary. And now I start to talk about what Mary and I discussed to her. Oftentimes, and I did this for many years until I understood the impact, I would actually stand behind the patient chair. I would be at the computer screen while my doctor would be gloving up. I would be talking about Mary over top, like my voice would just resonate and go right over top of the patient and hopefully land on the other side where my doctor was standing. I talked about her as if she wasn't there, and in a way that disconnected the engagement that I initially created when it was just her and I. So to practice a handoff effectively, one key takeaway would be find a way where you could position yourself so that you could maintain eye contact with your patient and hopefully your doctor, and you could be inclusive in the conversation with your doctor, but that the handoff would actually be a recap of what you and your patient talked about. It might sound something like, Mary, today you and I started off our appointment by highlighting something that was really important to you. You wanted to make sure that Dr. Ward looks at that top left area. You mentioned it's been really sensitive when you've been brushing, and I won't continue on time, but the idea is that I'm actually just recapping what I heard her say. I might pause along the way. Did I get that right? And I will also reflect to my doctor. So I'm not isolating my doctor who's standing there listening, and that I fold him or her into the conversation. But a big shift in engagement would be to consider, how do I make this inclusive with the patient and my doctor and not exclusive? As soon as the doctor walks in, we give our attention to him or her. We move to our sort of transaction mode, like, ooh, I got to get to my keyboard and I got to start catching up on my notes while he or she is doing the exam. And we sort of break this engagement. Part of partnership, and I used the word earlier, co-discovery. Co-discovering with the patient means I'm looking at all the ways that I can stay in connection with my patient throughout the appointment. The second I start, it's one of the reasons why the change in the chair from laying flat to the doctor comes in to sitting them upright. I want to re-engage them in a more equitable physical way, right? If they're laying flat and they're below, they're sort of, it's sort of this power over, power under. So it's one of the reasons why I sit the patient up as well. So as the handoff goes, I'm trying to focus on specifically keeping my patient engaged. I finish the conversation by potentially, now, sometimes if I have a chatty Cathy patient and I'm running short on time, I might say at the end, I don't think I missed anything, Mary. You didn't stop me, so I'm assuming, I covered all that we talked about. Or I may look at my patient and not think, I'm not sure if they're fully engaged, and say, tell me what I missed. Tell me what you would add, and the things that we've talked about today. And so again, you may look at this handoff and say, I might not do any of that, but if you could practice one of the things on here, if you have room for one thing, it would be look at ways where you can maintain eye contact with the patient, keep them sitting up while you do the handoff, and consider ways where you're folding the patient consistently into the conversation to maintain that connection that was established when you sat down with the patient. So I'm coming back to this. I already told you I was really stuck on it. I'm just captured by the language used here. And so we've talked about in this short time, it's already 8:51, in this short time, different ways to shift the current patterns you might have, in hopes that as you evaluate those patterns and start to kind of like scratch your head and say, maybe I do want to reevaluate those things, you have some different choices and to rely on to look at ways in which you can shift patterns here. I mentioned that it was going to kind of capture 3 systems. We've talked about clinical calibration. That is one system happening consistently in team meetings. I also mentioned sitting down together as a team, maybe capturing a few nuggets that I talked about for the handoff, and writing the handoff that you want to have happen in your practice. I also have not yet mentioned one critical system that I also think is instrumental in different ways we engage patients, and that's the morning huddle. And this one should be low-hanging fruit for you. I'm imagining you have some form of a morning huddle already. And I thought I would just hit the highlights of what I think are an effective morning huddle. I really like the idea of a morning huddle being all team engaged, right? Sometimes practices will get into the habit of having one person talk about all the things that need to be discussed in the morning huddle. It really reduces engagement. We're looking at a morning huddle as a way to prepare for patients today. And since everyone in the practice is going to have some touch point of patient engagement today, it's really much more effective to have different team members own different parts to the morning huddle. I like hygiene to own the critical components of their columns, the highlights of the patient conversations that we want to make sure everybody's aware of. I like the front office team to talk about new patients and maybe patients who need to stop up front to take care of balances, or any other nuggets. I like your restorative team to talk about the patients that are coming in today, and even folding in all of the departments. Are there patients who are in the restorative side who we might, transition to hygiene if there is open time? So those might be things that you're currently doing. One of the things that I'm going to ask you to do is pay attention to pattern in your morning huddle tomorrow or Monday. And that pattern is this: pay attention to the stories you tell yourself about patients' behaviors and patient choices as they enter your practice. Specifically, I'll say, and I remember this patient like I saw him yesterday, when I first started to practice hygiene at the last office that I was in before I moved into practice management. I was fairly new, and we were doing a morning huddle, and fairly new, maybe like 6 months into it. So I had seen this patient one time, but went under the radar of this particular topic. So I'm seeing him a second time. He was on a 3-month recare, and he was coming in, and this time he was due for images. He was due for radiographs. And so I say that Jim is coming in and he's due for radiographs, and immediately the team lets me know he's going to say no. He's not going to say yes. He always says no to radiographs. And I'm like, oh man, geez, bummer. And I'm worried. I've already looked at his perio chart. Man, I'm a newer hygienist to this practice. I'm worried about some maybe areas of perio. And I'm like, gosh, maybe naively, I'm thinking, well, I don't know why he says no to X-ray. So I'll just ask him today. So in my naiveness, Jim sits down, a little bit of a grumpy toes. And I say, I don't throw my team under the bus and say, they said you were going to say no to x-rays, but I want to know why. Didn't quite say that. I had evolved a little bit, but I did say, hey, I noticed the last few times you were in prior to your last visit, You hadn't allowed us to do x-rays. Tell me more. And I won't go into, based on the time, all the things that Jim shared, but it was the first time that I recognized how seductive the morning huddle can be to a patient's story. I did understand that Jim was saying no to x-rays, primarily from the financial piece. And we eventually came to a place where my doctor agreed that we would take the images and not charge him just because we needed it. And, I won't get into all the details, but it was one of the very first times that I remember morning huddle can be a seductive, storytelling, inefficient meeting about patient information that limits our ability to have different conversations when we go and we see this patient in our appointment. So I want you to be cautious and aware and pay attention to your patterns in your morning huddle. So I want to leave you with a couple thoughts here before we get to the top of the hour. Another favorite book of mine. I love James Clear. He's got an amazing podcast too. So if you don't want to read the book, just listen to his podcast, Onto the Drive, and you'll hear some incredible parts. I know so many people have read this. So one of my favorite quotes in James Clear book is, "You didn't rise to the level of your goals. We fall to the level of our system." So, earlier I talked about, and I see this all the time in practice management. We start working with docs who say my treatment plan acceptance is low. So they have a metric or they have a goal that they're aiming to achieve for treatment plan acceptance. And one of the very first things that we peel back and really lean into is, what are all the processes that feed you to have a different, to get a different outcome, to get the goal that you want, right? So you're aiming to improve your case acceptance. Great, that's a number, that's a goal. But what are the systems that feed you improving that goal? So Clear talks about this, goal versus system. So a goal of yours might be, I'm going to lose 15 pounds. And a system would be, or an atomic habit would be, to create a system where you start tracking your food take. Incremental steps to get to the outcome, the goal, right? So if a goal is to run a 5K, it's not for me, by the way, then a system would be to use maybe the Couch to 5K app. And if a goal for you is to we're at the end of the year, my business partner and I, Tiffany, are working with our practices at setting goals and coming up with budgeting and collection and production goals. And so those are just goals. They're static. The real work begins by assessing, how do we achieve these goals? And with teams, we're looking at all the systems that will feed us getting to these goals. And I'm leaving you with that primarily because I think it's incredibly important to not be stuck on the goal, but to be, highly energized by all the systems that feed you getting to the goal. So let's hit some highlights really quick here, so I don't get in trouble for running late. Highlights this. Number one, consider how you might meet as a team to calibrate. So just figure out a cadence to sit down as a team. Don't be worried about all the stuff that happens in the meeting. You guys know dentistry. You'll know what to do. Just create the time. Think about building a system, a really, really simple system. Maybe half of the things on that checklist didn't feel like it would land for you. So sit down and write and document a basic system for handoffs. But be committed and get married to the idea that system needs constant calibration. We need to constantly come back to the things that we say we're going to do to really assess, are we doing that? Maybe just choose one thing different from tonight. That's just one of my favorites of all times, is when I'm feeling overwhelmed and there was some good ideas or mediocre ideas. Maybe that's what you would call them. Just choose one thing you want to be different. My hope is that you'll see systems as a pathway to achieve your goals, not as a document and an ordinance, but a pathway to achieve the goals. If you're stuck in not getting to your goals, start assessing the systems that feed those goals. And know this, that the ultimate decision maker and case acceptance is your patient. And looking at different ways where you can gently start to shift the engagement in your co-discovery conversations, or if you call them treatment conversations, meeting your patient where you are is a great place to start. Really quickly, yay and want. Our 2024 courses for the Pankey admin, which I am a co-facilitator in, sold out, but we've got 2025. Pankey hygiene, dang it, sold out. But man, if you're really, really excited about either of these, reach out, see if you can be added to a wait list. There's only a few seats left in the Pankey assistant experience. Here are the dates for the 2025 courses. We don't have the assistant one yet, but that's coming really soon. If you want to learn more about the Pankey assistant, you can scan here. You can also go to pankey.org.